turn it over to Johanna Fernandez, long distance runner in the campaign to bring Mumia home. Before there was a campaign to bring Mumia home. We thank her for her presence and her organizing spirit that has guided us for so many years as part of this movement. And we have a simple question for you, Johanna, which is of course very complex. Right? So why now? Right? Why now? We want you to help us to think through this political moment where there's a paralysis of analysis, and to help us to understand what the movement can take from this seemingly opening right now at this moment.
So how does one follow Pam Africa and Glenn Ford, is the question. And maybe I need to stand up, because I'll think better if I stand up. So I think the challenge before us is to educate a new generation of revolutionaries, radicals, activists, people of conscience about the significance of Mumia's case and why he is one of us. Why freeing Mumia is really about strengthening the fight against racism, the fight against white supremacy, the fight against capitalism and imperialism. Many of us who are here today, although not all of us, were part of the inspiring movements of the 1990s that stopped the execution of Mumia Abu-Jamal. Those were demonstrations in the tens of thousands. And in many ways, Mumia was at the helm of that resurgence in movement building of the 90s, right before 9/11. Remember that? So there were the 60s, and then there were the 90s. And what were people fighting in the 90s? Anti-immigrant sentiment, Proposition 187 against immigrants, remember that? Driving while black on the New Jersey Turnpike. We were fighting for the environment, remember that? In the 1990s, massive movements, Teamsters and Turtles, fighting against the G8 and the leaders of empire, against the third world debt. Remember that? And Mumia during this period became the face of the criminal justice system and the face of the movement against the death penalty. We're not talking about 3 people. We're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people marching in New York, in Chicago, in Paris, in Brazil. And all of these movements that I've identified were together. We were also fighting against so-called welfare reform initiated by Clinton. So this is who Mumia is. In many ways, Mumia was the Che Guevara of my generation, of our time. And we were all inspired because he had been demonized by the state. The state was attempting to execute him. And still from the darkest dungeons of this society, he was telling us that there is something in the soul that cries for freedom. And I just read his transcript because we're trying to do something with Mumia that's quite important. So we needed his transcript, and it took literally moving a mountain to get his transcript from the registrar in the Vermont School Goddard. And he was getting an undergraduate degree days before his execution. And his teacher, his professor, I decided, Jesus Christ, it's taken me moving a mountain to get this damn transcript, and I was just looking at it in front of me on my computer, and I was like, why don't I fucking read this thing? And I read that his professor says, 3 days before execution, Mumia just told me that he is in this struggle to get an undergraduate degree because it is a distraction, an important distraction in the presence of that certain possibility before him, execution within 3 days. He was supposed to have been executed on August 17th, 1995.
We stopped it.
And an international movement stopped it. So this is why Mumia was so famous, because he wrote Live from Death Row, the first prisoner to talk about the experience of being a black man on death row from the inside, that humanized for the first time, you know, the devil in our society. So that's who Mumia was. That's who Mumia was to us. But Mumia was something else for the state. And Glenn Ford has given us a sense of what he represented for the state. We know that every generation has had radicals who have been targeted by the state because the state has to make an example of what happens when you stand up and fight against the system. Not against, you know, this that's wrong and that's wrong, but revolutionaries. So in the late 19th century, there were the Haymarket martyrs. There were Sadko and Vanzetti, the anarchists, in the early 20th century. We had the Rosenbergs executed. These are people who were executed, right? Executed. The Rosenbergs were executed. And then, in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, it was the turn of black people to be the example, that person that was going to be killed by the state. And Mumia became that person. Former Black Panther, radical journalist, uncompromising in his exposure of racism, of the predations of imperialism and capitalism. Mumia wrote an article about white power in Philadelphia in 1979. Literally, he called it the rise of white power in the aftermath of the civil rights and Black Power movement. So this is who Mumia was. And he was the man that the state identified, the man that we are going to hold up. This is what happens to you if you dare to challenge the state and challenge the system in which we live. He was killed, he was accused of killing a white police officer. Now, in the post-civil rights movement era, the police are elevated to larger than life, right? And in many ways, that is being consolidated, that idea is being consolidated today with the fact that the Congressional Black Caucus has now really, truly, in the books, elevated cops to higher than life. So what is Mumia called? A cop killer. And that term has been used over and over and over again against Mumia, but also against other former Black Panthers and political prisoners in prison today, to instill fear in white people and to legitimize the criminal justice system, right? Because the cop killer, when you think about a cop killer, you don't think about white folks. Even though the majority of people who kill cops, who are the majority of people who kill cops? White folks. But in the mind of American society, you know, the Joe or Jane on the block, when you talk about a cop killer, we're talking about black militants. We're talking about Black Panthers. We're talking about the black kid on the corner who is going to kill the cop. And the cop represents essentially our only hope of hanging on to white supremacy in America. So I'm saying this because the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, which has been essentially kept in the spotlight by the movement, certainly, but also by the Fraternal Order of Police, which is the largest police organization in the world. Birthplace, Philadelphia. Trains with the Israeli police. It is this organization that in many ways represents white supremacy. This is the elite core of white supremacy in the United States. The folks who kill black and brown people on the street, nothing happens to them until recently, right? So, and nothing happens to them, what was that?
If they're police.
And if they're police, of course. No, nothing happens to them if they're police, because they're police. Until recently, right? Because there's been a movement that has finally challenged that. Okay, so Mumia Abu-Jamal is the poster child of the Fraternal Order of Police. Now, I don't know if you guys have followed this, and it really is incredulous, but the Fraternal Order of Police made Life from Death Row a bestseller because they flew a plane over the publisher's headquarters protesting the fact that Life from Death Row had even been published, the book that Mumia wrote. So of course it's going to go to the top of the charts. New York Times bestseller. What else? What else are we talking about? In 2014, the president, the black president at the time, named Debo Adegbile to be part of the Department of Justice, to lead the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. The Fraternal Order of Police found out that Adegbile was somehow marginally connected to Mumia's case. Immediately they go to Congress, to the Senate and the Congress floor. They pass out literature essentially smearing Adegbile with the crime that Mumia is accused of, a cop killer. And guess what happened to Debo Adegbile? Everyone, and he is the top attorney in the United States on the issue of voting rights. He's a litigator. He's litigated in front of the Supreme Court. No one around. It was a shoo-in for Obama until Mumia got added to the conversation, and all of the senators and all of the congressmen, Republican and Democrats, voted against Debo Adegbile because the Fraternal Order of Police was essentially saying, if you vote for Adegbile, you're voting for a cop killer, and Mumia Abu-Jamal. A teacher was fired in New Jersey because she sent Mumia her children's get well letters. The Fraternal Order of Police got a hold of this and she was fired. She was a beloved teacher. Wow. What else happened? Mumia had to give a speech at Goddard. That's his alma mater. He was the graduation speaker. The Fraternal Order of Police sent death threats to the university. They protested, they came in, they did everything under the sun. They couldn't stop the college from allowing Mumia to give the speech. What did they, yes. What did the Fraternal Order of Police do the next day? They walked into Congress, state Congress in Pennsylvania, and they forced Congress to pass a law, the Re-Victimization or something Act. I don't remember what it's called, a gag law that prevents prisoners from speaking in Pennsylvania the next day because when prisoners speak, they actually hurt and traumatize the victim's family. I'm not making this up, guys. I'm not making this up. So this is the latest, but you know, the people who've been around for a long time can explain and tell you all of the ways in which the Fraternal Order of Police has used Mumia to essentially strengthen the apparatus of incarceration in the United States. In the 1990s, John DeLilio, the head criminologist for the ruling class, in one of the major newspapers called Mumia what? A super predator. First line. You can look it up. He was, you know who he was working with? Bill Clinton.
Bill and Hillary Clinton.
Bill and Hillary Clinton. And so John DeLilio writes an article calling Mumia a super predator, and this is why we have to crank up the apparatus of incarceration. This is why law and order is what we need, and guess what emerges shortly thereafter but the crime bill. The crime bill. So, I'll say one more thing. The last time we were in court around the issue before us, that is going to bring Mumia home. But of course, the opening is here. We're going to have to throw the boulder, like the big rock, off the ledge.
That's right.
Into the precipice. So he's coming home, but we need to do the work.
Yeah.
Because the last mile is the hardest mile, but it is certain if we fight for it.
Yes.
So the last day of the trial, of the hearing, it wasn't a trial, it was a hearing before Leon Tucker, we're all outside, the courtroom is closed. In comes Maureen Faulkner, the white grieving widow that has been used as a prop by the Fraternal Order of Police to keep Mumia in prison. You see the race politics here? And she's being protected from this black cop killer monster in prison. Meanwhile, Mumia is like a fucking kitten. Really, of all the Black Panthers, if you listen to Mumia, he's actually the kitten in terms of his mannerism and how he speaks, and everything is carefully crafted. Okay, and which gives you a sense of like the distortion that is the media in this country, and the influence of the police on the media, because all the journalists essentially mouth everything that the Fraternal Order of Police says. Okay, great. So I'm going to wrap this up with this last story.
Go ahead.
So we're all black. Most of us are black. There might be 2 or 3 white people, supporters, which we need, the John Browns of the world. But all of us are black. Maureen Faulkner comes in, and all of a sudden she disappears. The court is closed. The court is opened. The black people walk in. Who's already in the courtroom has gotten in from the inside? Maureen and all of the police. Fraternal Order of Police. It might as well have been the Million White Man and Woman March. In the courtroom, already seated. So where do you imagine the black people have to sit?
Back of the bus.
In the fucking back of the bus.
Oh, shit.
This is important because this case is about upholding white supremacy in this country through the power of the police. If we bring Mumia home, white supremacy is going to be hit, is going to be injured in a big way in this country. That's why it is important to bring Mumia home. This is about white supremacy. What is the institution of white supremacy in the United States? Mass incarceration. The prisons. That is the face, the real institutional face of white supremacy in the United States. And because Mumia is the most famous prisoner in the world, the Nelson Mandela of our time, the most known political prisoner, not because Mumia is better, because the fucking man was almost executed by the state. Right? That's why he's famous, because of all of the political prisoners, he is the only one that stood before the apparatus of death of the United States. And in fact, the movement to free political prisoners in the 1990s, and those who are here who led that movement today know, the political prisoners were like, we gotta focus on Mumia because the state is gonna kill him. So this is why he's so famous, and an international movement gathered in his defense. If we bring him home, the chips are coming down. The entire apparatus of incarceration, it's almost dead, but it's definitely gonna come down. And you know what's gonna happen in Philadelphia because of the corruption? Because of tampering with evidence on the part of the police, because of the homicidal character of the police, that the Department of Justice in 1979 in Philadelphia called the kind of behavior that, quote, shocks the conscience. I'm quoting them. This is what they said about the police department, the Department of Justice in 1979, and Mumia was framed by the police 2 years later in 1981. So if Mumia comes home, we're closer to revolution. White supremacy is weaker than it's ever been. And you know what about Mumia is important? That Mumia stands for the people at the bottom of society. He inspires all of us to stand up and fight. Not just black people, but Mexicans who are being persecuted on the border by the American state. He stands with Palestine. He stands with South Africa. He stands with Ireland. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about bringing back a revolutionary. And if Mumia comes home, guess what? All of the political prisoners, the black political prisoners, are going to have their stories increasingly told in the media. Yeah. So what do? I think now is the moment, really, to figure out how we're going to chip in. We've got 5 or 6 working groups. We've got a media working group. We've got a street action working group. Educators. Ministry.
And fundraising.
Fundraising. And community and labor outreach. You need to join one of these groups. We're putting together a structure. Please sign up and join one of these groups. And I'll just end by saying this. In 2010, we had the Occupy movement. Troy Davis was also facing execution. Remember that? Yep. Troy Davis was executed. Yep. The Occupy movement, however, made it popular to criticize capitalism in the United States. Shortly after that, the young man in Florida was killed, whose name is?
Trayvon Martin.
Trayvon Martin was killed. Michelle Alexander published The New Jim Crow. Then the man who was killed in the middle of nowhere, United States, help me out.
Michael Brown.
Michael Brown was killed. Before the Black Lives Matter movement emerged, people rioted in Ferguson. And in Baltimore, did you see the footage of what happened in Baltimore? It looked like Palestine. And the Black Lives movement emerged in that context. So even though we have an arsonist in the White House, movements have been building on the ground and they have shifted consciousness. Which is why Leon Tucker, who's a law and order judge, looks around, sees that people are questioning the police. He knows, because he's a black man, that there's a lot of police corruption in this case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, even if he personally thinks he might be guilty. And he knows that if we don't hold the line somewhere, as judges, there's going to be a crisis of legitimacy in America with this crazy man in the White House. So what we have is a situation in which even conservative judges are like, oh shit, let me do something that looks right, because we're going to lose it all. We need to exploit those contradictions of the ruling class, and the Mumia movement and Mumia as a figure is the weak point of this current crisis of American hegemony. So join us. In essentially fighting for the highest aspirations of humanity alongside of Mumia, and help us make history. Thank you.